they found steady rates of diagnosis of autism from 2004 to 2010, although before that there had been a sizable increase. And then a systematic review of all the studies worldwide by Baxter et al., where they found, well, the headline figure of 52 million cases of individuals diagnosed with autism in 2010, around 1 in 132 being the rate both in 1990 and in 2010, when you allow for different sorts of measures of counting. So little regional variation, little change over that time. So I think the rise in apparent rates of diagnosis probably reflect increased awareness, diagnostic criteria changing, as Judy told you about, and also diagnostic substitution. So we know that as rates of autism have gone up, the rates of a diagnosis of just intellectual disability without any further specification have gone down. And you can see in the figure here the enormous rise in rates that is used by campaigning charities like Autism Speaks, but also inset the figure that shows how the rate has risen in different states in America, and you can see how variable that is, and that reflects, I think, those different factors of provision, recognition, services, and so on. So going to the question, are we any closer to understanding autism across the whole spectrum, I want to linger for a moment on the word understanding. Judy's already mentioned the huge importance of researchers and the whole community listening to individuals with autism as co-partners in research. I think too often we expect people with autism to understand the neurotypical world, but we don't question how well we're understanding things from the autism point of view. You can also ask the question, what does it mean to understand autism? At what level of description are we really concerned? So in talks later today and particularly tomorrow, you'll hear about the understanding of the genetic basis of autism from Thomas Bouillon. You'll hear about autism at the level of the brain, what might be different in the way that the brain of a person with autism is wired up, and Dr. Murphy, I think, will talk about that. When we think about diagnosis, we're talking about behavior, and we can describe autism in terms of its behavioral differences from neurotypical development. But I'm actually most interested in thinking about the different way that people with autism see, process, understand, think about the world. So we have a behavioral diagnosis, and Judy already covered this, and also mentioned how the traditional triad of social impairments, communication impairments, and rigid and repetitive behavior in DSM-5 have been collapsed into social and communicative difficulties on the one hand, and rigid and repetitive traits. And those rigid and repetitive behaviors include, for the first time, sensory difficulties, sensory hyper or hyposensitivity. But underlying those behavioral features, we have, I believe, a number of cognitive characteristics, both assets and difficulties. And I think these are really key to understanding anything about autism or individuals with autism at a deeper level. So I don't believe that there's any one psychological cognitive theory that can help us to understand all the different aspects that make up autism, even in a single individual. But I think we have some good theories, and I'll come back to these from time to time through my talk, but these include the idea that the social and communication problems in autism are partly explained by a difficulty that people with autism have in intuitively tracking what other people are thinking. So neurotypical people, sometimes to their detriment, automatically recognize what other people might be thinking. And people with autism usually do so only through an effortful theorizing about it, thinking consciously, and hard work. And that leads to some differences in everyday life. And then we have non-social skills and difficulties in autism. The rigidity, the difficulty coping with novelty and change that many people with autism tell us about is sometimes described and explained in terms of problems with executive functions. That's the umbrella term for all those complex, high-order functions that your frontal lobes perform, like planning, shifting and inhibiting all behavior. So all of us who are finding ourselves clapping when we know we shouldn't be are not doing very well with our frontal lobes in inhibiting that behavior for this context. Also monitoring, generating new ideas and so on. All of these come under executive functions. These are incredibly important because I'm sure we all know highly intelligent individuals with autism who, for example, can get all the qualifications to go to university but can't cope in their everyday life there because of the difficulty in organizing themselves, getting to the place they need to be at the right time, and so on. And then understanding the assets in autism, the things that people with autism are really extraordinarily good at, and the things they're often much better at than neurotypicals. And much of that, I think, has to do with an eye for detail that's being described under the term weakness of coherence. So understanding autism at this level, at the level of the mind, can really make a difference. It helps us to understand and help with things that are difficult for people with autism. And I've just put a few examples here. So in terms of executive functions, we can think about the ways that all of us scaffold and find techniques to cope when we're overloaded, when our frontal lobes are coping with too many demands. Well, what do? We write something down, we use a diary, we set a timer. All of these things are really helpful and can be really helpful for people with autism, even in situations that we might not consider to be overload, but of course are, because all those social demands are going on all the time. Easing change, giving people with autism visual signals like timers to see, well, that this session is finishing, something different is going to happen next. And then in terms of mind reading or theory of mind, we need to remember that even when we make things visual, trying to cater towards autistic processing style, we still, without thinking about it, use communication in a very mind-reading kind of way. So one woman I know with autism won't use bathrooms that have this particular sign on them because she never wears a skirt or a dress. And so for her, that sign doesn't apply. So she's taking even the visual symbol literally, rather than thinking about the intention of the sign maker. But this is a problem for her. And similarly for the young man who will stop in the middle of the road when the traffic light changes to a red man standing, because he's now doing what the sign says, even though we understand that the sign really means be safe, rather than literally obey it. And then thinking about detail focus. Oh, and also this nice example from Rita Jordan, the way that we use language with each other and with people with autism. When you say to a child with autism, we're going swimming in the minibus, maybe he or she is thinking about this kind of scenario rather than what we intend to say. And then thinking about detail focus. When we consider looking at the world at a level of detail, a level of brain that the rest of us miss, then what we count as being the same may not apply for somebody with autism. So your visual picture symbol system that you're using, does your picture of the particular cereal look exactly like the particular cereal? And what about when it changes brand? And what about the difference in size, for example? How do we think about differences in detail? And then if you're looking at, you're sharing an experience, trying to share an experience with somebody with autism, we're looking at a street scene. Well, I'm looking at a street scene, but maybe the person with autism that I'm working with or talking to is seeing a picture of a logo on a backpack because that's what he or she is really interested in. So moving on beyond understanding to the question of understanding the whole spectrum. And I'm going to say a little bit about understanding the whole spectrum in terms of all levels of ability, all presentations, across the lifespan and across the globe. And of course, I'll in many cases be highlighting what we don't know and what we need to do more research on, as well as areas where we have begun to do some work. But I want to, again, linger for one moment on the notion of a spectrum. So one thing that we definitely know is that everybody is different. That's true of every individual. It's also true of individuals on the autism spectrum. And perhaps because people with autism are not part of a social herd, like neurotypicals, individuals with autism are even more individual. But when we think about a spectrum, I would suggest that we need to take into account the possibility that different parts of autism, for example, the rigid and repetitive features and the social and communication features, may have different underpinnings. And our work has suggested that they have somewhat separate genetic influences, separate brain bases, and can be disentangled in terms of those cognitive tasks. And this is backed up by the finding, which I think is very much in keeping with Lorna's pioneering work that we just heard about, that when you look in the general population, rather than looking in a clinic where to have an autism diagnosis you have to have all these things together, when you look in a general population, you find many individuals, in fact the largest group of individuals, are those who have difficulties in only one area. So although these different features cluster above chance, there are many children out there who only have social difficulties, for example, or only have rigid repetitive traits without the other accompanying difficulties. And I have a couple of nice quotes here, again reflecting what Judy said, that Lorna really so often said it first. So Uta's quote is, some so-called new ideas in autism research come and go, but if one reads Lorna Wing's early writing, she's already said it. For instance, long before anyone else, she questioned that Canna's autism was a single separate identity, and Judy has covered that history very nicely. And Michael Rutt has said Campbell's study, which we also heard about, was enormously important in showing that autism couldn't be boiled down to a single thing, and that was a major insight. And it was both inspiring and depressing to me to realize that just when we were writing about the fractionation of the autistic triad, about thinking about pulling apart and seeing things in isolation, well, Lorna had written this paper with John in 1971, where she said the difficulty of explaining the whole syndrome on the basis of any single abnormality is illustrated, so she said it already. So I would suggest that when we think about the spectrum, we don't think about the autism spectrum on one axis. These are scores on the CAST, the Childhood Autism Spectrum Test, and you can add up all the scores and put people on a continuum. But I would suggest that actually our work suggests we should think about the spectrum in multi-dimensions, that where you are on the spectrum in terms of your rigid and repetitive behavior, for example, is largely independent of where you are in terms of your social and communication traits. And so we need to think about people in the round, and of course about the individual. So having said that about the spectrum, are we any closer to understanding autism across the whole spectrum, first of all, the whole spectrum of abilities? And I want to just note that much research excludes participants with lower IQs, explicitly excludes. And the number of research grants that say we're going to test a population that all have IQ above 70, or even above 85, it's excluding vast numbers of individuals with autism, arguably some of the individuals we most need to know about and understand and find the best way to work with. So assessments are strongly needed for the full spectrum of ability, and I want to tell you just about a couple of in fact, PhD students of mine who I think have done this very well. So Antonia San Jose Caceres came to work with me while she was a teacher in a special school, and she did her PhD part-time, and the reason she persuaded me that I should take her as a student was that she was passionate about doing research with the children she worked with, who were children who had autism and intellectual disability, in some cases fairly profound intellectual disability. And she wanted to test theory of mind in those children who were usually excluded. And she used the penny hiding game. So in penny hiding game, you don't need any language to explain or to take part. You show the child that you're hiding a penny in one of your hands, and the child gets to choose which hand they think it's in. And you do this a few times, and then you just give the penny to the child, and you see what they do. And most children understand now it's their turn to hide the penny. But many children with autism hide the penny physically, but not from the person's mind. So they may, for example, transfer the penny in plain sight and then ask you to guess. Or they may leave one hand open, or they might present both hands but tell you which hand the penny is in. So they understand the game at one level, but they don't understand about hiding information from another mind. And using that kind of task, Antonia was able to include children who had a receptive language level of a 2-year-old, even though they were much older, on average 12 years. And she was able to show that stripping away a lot of extra demands from tasks like language and memory and so on, you can still see that people with autism, children with autism, are struggling with this relative to children with intellectual disability without autism. And that it relates to what teachers are saying about everyday social abilities. At the other end of the spectrum, we've been trying to test subtle social difficulties in very high-functioning individuals with autism, who sometimes have a hard time conveying to those around them that actually doing social is hard work. So I want to try and show you on the videos that my student produced. And I think you'll get sound from this.
Hi, yeah, Max. I'm sorry, I have so much work to do. I'm literally leaving work now.
So after that clip, we asked high-functioning adults with autism, why did she say that? And we also asked them, if you were in the conversation, if you were Max, what would you say next? to her. And it's very interesting, the very logical answers that we often get. So very intelligent adults with autism may say, oh, she said she was leaving work because she works in a pub, which is a perfectly reasonable kind of answer. But I don't know, it's hard for you to see her facial expression on here because the lights aren't quite right for the screen, but it's pretty clear to most neurotypicals. The obvious answer is that she's telling a white lie to excuse being late home while she's in the pub socially. And the next one is even more excruciating, but I'll show you just so you can see the kinds of materials we have.
Right, I've been working on this for ages. I think I finally got it. I think I want my song to end like this. Hey,
yeah, that sounds really good.
So again, we asked people to tell us why he said that and what she might say back. And these sorts of tasks do help to capture the difficulties that high-functioning people with autism have in everyday life in working out what people are thinking in real time with the kind of subtle expressions that are usually involved. Just another example in a different area from my PhD student Stephanie Lees, who again was passionate after having had a very helpful and interesting placement at Queen's Mill School, became passionate again about extending her work on sensory sensitivities and differences to children who were lower functioning and didn't have expressive language. So she was interested in the idea that some sensory difficulties in autism may have to do with detail focus and a difficulty of using context, perhaps, to predict the next sensation. And the reason that we became interested in this is that apparently if you know the punch is coming, it doesn't hurt as much. Or in other words, when you are predicting the next sensory stimulus, it doesn't seem as intense. By contrast, if the next sensory stimulus is unexpected, unpredicted, it is unusually intense. So what Stephanie did was devise a way that she could find out about the sensory reactions of children with autism who, in this particular sample, had some receptive language to a reasonable level but didn't have expressive language. And what she did was make a number of different things. So one of them was an opaque box, and the child put their hand inside but they couldn't see inside the box. And Stephanie tested three conditions. Either the child just put their hand inside and felt something, and Stephanie measured how long the child chose to continue to explore that sensation. In another condition, the child had a context that fitted, so the child had a little bit of a sort of sensory story, like Sarah reached in the cupboard for her coat, and then the child put their hand inside the box, and they might feel cloth, which would be expected, or they might feel dry leaves, which would be incongruous or unexpected. We contrasted those three conditions: congruous context, incongruous context, and no context. And as well as sensation, just measuring how long they choose to keep their hand inside the box, we also had them listen to something, and they had to hold a headphone up to their ear. So how long do they choose before they put it down? How long do they choose to hold a flap up while they looked at a screen to see a stimulus? And how long did they choose to sort of puff a little bottle that had a scent in it to continue to smell something? We didn't try taste because that was too intrusive. And for those who had expressive language, we did ask them how much did you like the stimulus and how intense did it seem, and we tried to explain that in various ways. But it was nice that for all the participants, we could measure how long they chose to interact with the different sensations. And what we found was that compared to no context, the children who were neurotypical explored this stimuli longer when they were unexpected, when they were incongruous. But the children with autism showed really rather little context effect, as if they weren't using context to predict what they might experience next. We think that might be a little clue to some of the sensory differences in autism. If you imagine when we go to lunch, if you took a spoonful of what you thought was ice cream and it turned out to be mashed potato, even if you like mashed potato, you probably have a kind of jarring, unpleasant response. So thinking about capturing the whole spectrum, I also wanted to make you aware that I think the evidence is accumulating that the genetic influences that affect many individuals with diagnosed autism are also on a smooth continuum with the genetic influences on traits, subclinical traits of autism, having a bit of one or more aspects of autism. And we've recently completed a twin study of autism based in the Twins Early Development study, which looked at all of the twins born in England and Wales in 94, 95 and 96. And we went to see the families in their homes. And the short story from this is that autism is highly heritable, but we knew that. But the genetic influences on autism are shared with genetic influences on autistic traits measured in the general population. And this has recently been also confirmed at a molecular genetic level in work by Elise Robinson and others. So this, I think, fits with Lorna's adage that nature never draws a line. So thinking now about the whole spectrum, understanding the whole spectrum across all presentations and that heterogeneity of presentations, which isn't just to do with ability, of course. And I'm going to briefly talk about different strengths and weaknesses, different additional difficulties, talk a little bit about whether the presentation may be different in some females on the autism spectrum, and also talk a little bit about challenging features and demand avoidance. That's something that Lorna and Judy particularly set myself and Liz Janus to research. So in that twin study that I've just shown you, we also gave a lot of tests of executive function, of detail focus or weak coherence, of theory of mind. And Victoria Brunsden, who's shown here in her roller derby kit, could look at how an individual child, where they fell in terms of their pattern of strengths and difficulties. And you can see just the variability here. But there are children with autism who only have an executive function deficit at this particular point in time, only have a theory of mind deficit, and about 30% who have difficulties in all, or characteristics in all three areas. I shouldn't say difficulties because the detail focus is often a strength. And of course, autism is also heterogeneous because it rarely comes alone. So comorbidity or additional difficulties are common. And it's very important, and I think increasingly recognized, that it's often these additional difficulties that make life problematic for people on the autism spectrum, rather than necessarily their autism itself. So anxiety and depression, ADHD, OCD, developmental coordination difficulties, epilepsy, intellectual disability, sleep problems for which there are really good and tractable treatments for many people, sensory sensitivities and so on. And so again, in that twin study, we've been measuring the rates of those additional problems. And just briefly to tell you what we're finding, about over 50% of the twins with autism or autism spectrum conditions have clinical levels of emotional difficulties, that's anxiety, depression. 30% have clinical levels of conduct difficulties, and over 50% have clinical levels of hyperactivity. Much lower in their co-twins who are more equivalent to the neurotypical population. And again, for many individuals, it's a coming together of several difficulties. So only 24% had no problems in our particular sample, who were aged about 12 to 14 at this time point. And 18% had difficulties in all three of those areas I've told you about. This you don't need to see the details of, it's to remind me to tell you that we have data at various age points, age 4, age 7, and at that 12 to 14 point. And the bottom line is that in autism overall, although individuals differ of course, from 4 to 14 years, emotional difficulties increase, conduct problems decrease, and hyperactivity is stable. And in the neurotypical group, most problems are decreasing over that time period. And I want to just briefly mention the work that, again, an ex-PhD student of mine, Victoria Hallett, did, that highlights how important it is who you ask about these kinds of difficulties, and the importance of asking multiple informants whenever you can. So we have both self-report and parent report on these different, in this case, different aspects relevant to anxiety. In neurotypical groups, in Tourist study and in others, you find that by 12 to 14 years, by adolescence, young people themselves are reporting more anxiety, more of these internalizing problems than their parents report for them. So young people are carrying now their own private life of stress and angst that goes with being a teenager, and their parents don't always know about it. For children with autism, it seems to be the other way around, and the parents are reporting more anxiety and depression than the young people themselves. And whether that's to do with difficulties in communicating what you're experiencing, in analysing and reflecting on what you're experiencing, or finding the right label for it for the people with autism is a good question, but important to note that different pattern of findings. So I also want to talk about different presentations across the whole spectrum in terms of women on the autism spectrum. And again, Judy has so nicely talked about the passion that she and Lorna shared for really understanding how different autism may look in women and girls. With Katharina Dworzinski, we looked, again, to advantage of the fact we have a population-based sample, because if you just go and look at the women and girls who received an autism diagnosis, then we're in danger of circularity, because 90% of the research is done with males. Some studies, many studies, exclude females explicitly because they think they'll get too small numbers to analyse. And so we're going at the problem with a male stereotype view of autism, informed by male research, and our diagnostic criteria may just not be fair, we don't know. So if you start with a diagnosed sample, we're in danger of circularity. So we started with a population sample, again, that twins early development study. And we looked at all of the girls and all of the boys who had high autistic traits. So on the Childhood Autism Spectrum test, they scored really highly. And then we asked the question, what's the difference between those girls who have high autistic traits and meet diagnostic criteria, and those who have high autistic traits and don't have a diagnosis? And we asked the same question for the boys. And what we found was that for girls, the difference was that the ones who had a diagnosis often had low IQ and or additional behavioural problems that teachers noticed. So these were often externalizing problems, ADHD or conduct difficulties. In the boys, there was no such difference. So there's something about being a girl that makes that difference between getting a diagnosis or not. And there are at least two explanations for this. One is that high-functioning girls with autism fly under the radar, that we're missing those young women because they're sitting quietly in the back of the class and they're no trouble to anyone else, but they're suffering in silence. But the other possibility is that girls, if they have autism but only have autism, don't have additional problems like low IQ or additional conditions, they can compensate well, they can do well enough, and maybe they don't need a diagnosis, maybe they're genuinely doing okay. And I'm sure the story is different for different individuals, but the only way we can find out is to go and get that quality of life, that personal information, that personal experience from women and girls with autism. And I'm very pleased that we've recently been given a grant to go and do that with, again, starting with our twin sample, who will now be young women around 18 years old, and go and find out, for those who do and don't have meet diagnostic criteria, with high autistic traits, what is their life like? How are they managing? So we learned so much over the years. I've learned so much from going and talking to Lorna and Judy at Elliot House. And I had to have the cat pouring tea, both as a nod to Lorna's love of cats, and also because, of course, the first thing you do when you go to Elliot House or Lorna Wing Centre is sit down and have a cup of tea. And you learn so much. And one of the things that Lorna and Judy told us was that they were seeing, this was a few years ago, that they were seeing a lot of children whose most presenting problem was that they avoided all demands. So they told us, and we illustrated with so many really captivating cases, the young people they were seeing who were the hardest to help or teach, who were excluded even from expert autism settings that we used to dealing with severely problematic behaviours, who could find a way to work constructively with a whole range of children. Some of these settings said that the usual autism approaches failed, that repetition and routine didn't work, that what worked was being off the wall, was engaging in lots of pretend play or using lots of humour, catching people by surprise. These were young people who were apparently more socially sophisticated because to avoid their demands, they were sometimes using socially sophisticated strategies. So this might be a young girl who comes in for assessment, and she's 11, she's apparently of average intellectual development. She engages very nicely in the Wendy house, slightly over dramatic, but when she's asked to come and play some games with the psychologist, she changes completely. And suddenly, she's either trying to charm her way, oh, I'll do that afterwards, but where did you get your earrings? They're so beautiful, tell me about them. Or, I'm a tiger, I can't do that, tigers can't hold pens. Ring ring on the pretend phone, oh, that's the President of the United States, he says I mustn't do any of this work, I must talk to him instead. To, if you make me do that, I'll tell my mother you're interfering with me. If you make me do that, I'll cut myself. If you make me do that, I'll attack you. So, they're often seeing this in girls as well in a puzzling way. So that was back in around 2010, 2011, when pathological demand avoidance was much discussed, but really very little research. There was only one paper published in a clinical research journal at the time. But there was huge parental concern and a huge web presence, and clearly a need for more information. We were puzzled by the fact that there were similarities, of course, to anybody else on the autism spectrum. The lack of embarrassment, that same 11-year-old girl, if she wanted to escape the situation out shopping with her mum, she might start to take her clothes off or lie down on the floor or wet herself, apparently not at all concerned by what other people would think of her. Lots of anxiety, of course, difficulty perhaps in reading social cues, but also some tantalizing differences from other people on the autism spectrum. Maybe the gender ratio more skewed towards girls. A love of pretend play developing at the expected age in these young people. Non-verbal communication being okay, not apparently wooden, nothing about eye contact being odd as far as we can see, and not responding to reward or routine. So we got interested in this, and I have to really credit Liz O'Nions, who was my PhD student at that time, and did a whole PhD on this population. And it was actually only when we went to talk about what we were trying to do at an NAS conference about pathological demand avoidance that I realized as we were about to go on stage that I just set my PhD student the most impossible task to research a group who by definition didn't want to do anything that they were going to be asked to do. So she had to think of all sorts of ways that we could find out information about children who were receiving this label or were resistant to demands. And one of the things she did was use standard measures, and she showed that children who get the label pathological demand avoidance have a profile that is like a mixture between autism and conduct problems, but they also have very, very high anxiety according to parental report. And there's also developed a measure for extreme demand avoidance, and use this to show that you could find a difference between those who either had a PDA label or where the parents suspected PDA compared to children with autism who had a lot of additional conduct problems, and also compared to children who had conduct problems and sometimes callous or emotional behavior, but not autism. And Christopher Dilberg has also used items from the disco to do a screening in the Faroe Islands, and very interestingly comes up with figures that suggest that for some of these individuals, these behaviors may be prevalent when they're young, but they grow out of them. So that's an encouraging message. And Liz and I have been working hard with Judy at Longing Centre to develop, and she just published a paper looking at which questions in the disco interview can help you to spot a pattern of demand avoidance. And we're continuing to research this question because, again, we want to understand at the underlying level. We've only scratched the surface of behaviour. I want to understand why some children find it so hard to comply. And it raises the question, why do typically developing children comply? Because we don't force children in our current culture, we don't beat them at school, we don't make them do what we want them to do, and yet children turn up at nursery school, and when the nice teacher says, come and sit on the carpet for story time, most of them come and sit down. Most of them don't take front at that demand. So why? Do they want to please other people? Do they care about reputation? Do they have a view of self that means that they know where they are in the hierarchy? Do they have a herd instinct? They just want to do what other kids do? And then why is complying so hard for children who show demand avoidance? Is it about anxiety? Is it about not knowing where you are in the social hierarchy that most children do what most adults say? Is it about not recognizing, not responding to positive emotions, maybe finding them even averse? Some of these children, if you praise something they've done, say, that's a lovely picture, they'll rip it off. So we're trying to find out. And now going on to understanding the whole spectrum across the lifespan. And I'm very pleased that later today you'll have a talk about this from Professor Digby Tanton, who's really one of the experts, and of course also Jeremy, our chair, is spearheading a big effort to find out much more about autism in old age. So thinking across the whole lifespan, one of the things we can be pleased about, I think, is that there have been now a lot of studies that are beginning to tell us about the earliest months of the development of children who will later have a diagnosis of autism. And this has been possible by looking at families where there's already a child with a diagnosis of autism and where a new baby is expected, and that new child who's genetically at higher risk of autism, of course most of them will be neurotypical in their development, but some of them will have traits of autism and some will have a diagnosis of autism. That new infant can be tracked from birth, and you can see what are the first signs of autism. When does the developmental trajectory of a child with autism differ from the developmental trajectory of a child who's not going to have autism? And I think many of us, when these studies started, thought that the first signs, when we looked closely, would really be from birth. But actually, very interestingly, there's little evidence for very early differences. Also, within these studies, there's little evidence for a separate regression subgroup. So while many parents feel that their child was developing normally and then lost skills, when you track skills in a very detailed way, you usually see that it's a more gradual coming away from the normal trajectory. And that's also something I think I remember Lorna saying to me, that actually if you really ask questions closely, you see that there are lots of little signs before that 18-month apparent sudden drop-off. The earliest differences that are spotted in the lab, I mean when you've got sort of technical equipment, are actually not in social areas, but in non-social tasks, and particularly in attention, in sticky attention. So around 6 months or so, infants who will later have an autism diagnosis, many of them find it difficult to disengage from one stimulus on the screen, if it's still there, to look at a new stimulus that's just appeared somewhere else. So that kind of sticky attention seems to be an interesting early sign. And it's not until around 12 months that we actually see social differences in everyday behaviour that mark out which children may end up having autism diagnosis. So actually, in the very early months, the children who later have autism are often smiling and cuddly and responsive, and that's really very different, I think, from what many people expected. So there's a debate about what this means, but really interesting work, and Tony Charman and Mark Johnson, working in the BASIS study in London, have done a lot of this fantastic work. But what about the other end of the lifespan? Now, this is where we haven't done so well so far. What about older adults? And we know that the aging population in general is growing, and individuals with autism, of course, like everyone else, spend most of their time as adults and are growing old. This nice paper by Carol Povey and others charted that really disproportionate lack of research on adults with autism and on older adults with autism in particular. This shows the number of publications just split up by the age of the individuals that they were studying. So, that's not meant to be there. Sorry, I'm meant to go see the thing behind. I can tell you about it. So, Ezra Zivrali is a PhD student who's working with me. We failed to get any grants to study aging in autism. People just don't find it sexy. But I think that old adults with autism are just as interesting and charming and worthy of our attention as small children with autism. And so Ezra has been on a shoestring trying to do research on autism in old people. And what's shown here is some clinic data, and I can put it on the slides that will be given to you later. It just shows that multiple additional difficulties are very common in older adults coming to a diagnostic centre for the first time. Some of these individuals coming for first diagnosis at age 70. And they're likely to have additional obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression, and so on, and as are the young individuals coming for first diagnosis. But I did want also to put in a plug, if you can help us recruit older people with autism, if you're in contact with grandparents of children with autism for studies that we're doing, we'd really like your help. And finally, the global perspective on autism. When we think about the whole spectrum, we should think about the whole world as well. And it's a really sobering thought that while 80% of autism research takes place in high-income settings, 80% of people with autism are living in low-income settings. And there's an urgent need, therefore, for feasible, low-cost diagnostic and intervention processes. We're not going to roll out the ADOS and ADI that costs thousands of pounds to train on, to buy the kit, to buy the forms. Those are not feasible in low-resource settings. And so Autism Speaks and INSA are trying to develop tools that are free and open access and are actually feasible to perform in a well baby clinic in Africa, for example. And we've also recently published a paper showing that the DORBA, the Development and Wellbeing Assessment, developed by Robert Goodman, which you can train yourself on in 30 minutes on the computer, and which, if you're in a low-resource setting, Robert Goodman will give you for free in one of the hundreds of languages it's being translated into, and which picks up not only autism, but most other diagnoses and difficulties. That works just as well as the ADOS in a population-based sample. So that's a plea for a more global perspective. And a final thought. This is a very nice quote from Michael Barron, of course, one of the founders of the NNS. He said of Lorna, she was the clearest explainer I ever knew of the complex disorder we know so well. And she had right little time, but in the nicest way, for all the many peddlers of transformative remedies and cures that beset so divisive a neurological condition. Lorna continually challenged herself and us. A remark she made to Adam Feinstein was that when they were traveling together to a conference was, we still don't really know what autism is. So I'll finish there, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me, to all of you listening, to all of the particularly students that have worked so hard with me, and Uto who's been a great mentor to me, and to Lorna for her continual and continuing inspiration. Thank you very much.